fastest growing interdisciplinary minor on campus. This area of study is an integrated, holistic approach to understanding the life experiences of children, as well as social and cultural constructions of childhood. It seeks to help students better understand the challenges facing children, both globally and locally, including the role of research, advocacy, and social justice in improving children's lives. We have many students in the program from education, but also from psychology, social work, sociology, English, communications, and other disciplines. Today, we affirm and celebrate the commitment of the BSU community to improving the lives of children here in southeastern Massachusetts and around the world. United Nations Universal Children's Day, which is marked internationally on November 20th, so actually Sunday this year, marks the date in 1959 when the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child. And on the same date, in 1989, the UN ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a list of articles specifically indicating what those rights are. So today is such an important day because it is an opportunity for us to ask ourselves how we are working to make the world a better place for children in big ways and small. And now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Bob Sylvester. Trying to condense his accomplishments is a task in and of itself, but I'm going to attempt to do that. Dr. Sylvester worked professionally for over 25 years from the mid-70s to 2001 in Africa, Asia, and Europe, before returning to academia in 2002, same year I came here to Bridgewater, where he currently serves as a professor of global literacies in the elementary and early childhood education department. He teaches undergrad seminars in storytelling, teacher training courses in writing and social studies, graduate courses in critical literacy and global literacies, as well as courses in the intersection of language and culture in the predoctoral program. He completed his PhD at the University of Bath in the UK. His dissertation focused on the study of 75 international schools in Africa and the model of human unity and diversity uncovered in their mission statements. He served as a consultant to the Ministry of Education in Sri Lanka. He was the head of the Westwood International School in Botswana for over a decade. During the 1980s, Dr. Sylvester worked as a UNESCO expert in reading for the United Nations Institute for Namibia. At the time, they were preparing to create an independent Namibia. He was responsible for the development of national curriculum guidelines in reading. He was a classroom teacher and reading specialist at the International School of Lusaka in Zambia, responsible for the K-12 program of instruction in reading, serving the school population of children from 75 countries, speaking over 90 languages and collaborating with a professional staff from 25 countries. He served in a leadership capacity on the board of the Association of International Schools in Africa, and he was named one of the founding co-editors of the Journal of Research and International Education from Sage Publications, and is still on the editorial board for that journal. His work has included supporting community development activities of the Baha'i, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, national communities of Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Sri Lanka, in the primary health care and literacy areas, volunteering also here in the U.S. To support adult literacy. He has presented extensively in Africa, Asia, Europe, and North America, seeking to engage others in building an understanding of what all children require in order to inherit a world worthy of their dreams. Dr. Sylvester has just completed a book manuscript, Cultivating Their Humanity, A Cultural History of International Education, 1851 to 1950. In this book, he ponders the question, what does a world-minded student look like? The book explores the link between education and world citizenship, through the narrative of international education in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the title of his talk today is 3 Lives, 3 Poems, 3 Worlds. Please welcome Dr. Belfort.
For your sake, I won't use the microphone. That's all right. But this is really a moment in time for me because I had a chance to look back at my diaries over the last 4 decades, back to 1985, in fact, specifically. And I had, at that point, already spent 10 years overseas after being a graduate student in this institution. Of course, in 1975, when I was a graduate student, it didn't look like it looks today. In fact, this building wasn't here. In fact, none of these buildings were here. In fact, everything on this side of the train tracks was swamp. And so when I came for my interview, it was really interesting because I was completely lost in a place that I thought I knew very well. And then I took the job, and my colleagues will be interested in this. I took the job because there was a Dunkin' Donuts on the way into the building. And about 6 months after I took the job, they took the Dunkin' Donuts. The name of the brief talk this morning, and I'd like to thank the Dean for inviting me to do this. She wanted me to talk longer, and I said, no, I can't remember that much stuff. 3 Lives, 3 Poems, and 3 Worlds. The 3 lives are a comment from my son, who was born and raised in Africa, who is now working as a full-time professional editor for a startup. He said that I had 3 lives. He said that my first life was until I graduated from this institution at the age of 25. And then another 25 years living on the other side of the planet. And he said when I came back, and he was at Brown University, he said, now you have your 3rd life. And it's very different from the first 2, and it's completely different from the first one. So just 3 lives, 3 poems. The speech itself is based on a poem I wrote to my grandson, Finn. Many of you have met Finn again this morning. And they were poems written to him when he was 19 days old, 19 weeks old, and 19 months old. And they referred to him as Finn McCool the Giant, Finn the Shipwright, like his great-grandfather, and Finn the Cosmic Wayfarer, which is the structure of today's talk. So it's a bit of an experiment, and we talked about experimenting with poetry. The writer's speech based on poetry is kind of an experimental verse form. We'll see how it works. In 1992, I was privileged to be able to celebrate the Convention on the Rights of the Child and Universal Children's Day in Botswana as head of the international school. And I discovered that recently by chance when I looked at my notes, my diary. That was almost 25 years ago. So it's really precious to me to be invited again to observe the Universal Children's Day and to observe and reflect, as my students have this morning, on the significance of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and how children view themselves in the world today. Let's begin by going back to the question I asked myself. This is, as Kathleen pointed out, this is Southern Africa, and Zambia was where I spent 14 years, that's in red. Botswana in white was where I spent 10 years, but I traveled extensively through South Africa and Namibia. In fact, I worked for the United Nations before Namibia was independent in 1990, working with effectively refugees who were in teacher training or magistrate training programs and preparing the government in exile for independence. So this was the story, this was the question I asked myself when I was a graduate student here, and I told my students, this is actually, and I would strongly recommend for the purpose of humility, that you keep your undergraduate and graduate theses as part of the most important student. And so this is actually my graduate thesis, and this was the question I asked in my graduate thesis. And my professor, who, I can't remember who it was, actually said, this is a good report. And then gave me a B. But the other reason I keep it is because if students are unhappy with their B, I keep it in my top drawer. And I will pull it out as a last resort. So this is a question that I started asking myself as a graduate student, and to be honest, I never finished quite answering the question. But it is very much the question that I think I may have discovered the framework for an answer to, thanks to my students. This is Finn. He's 3.5 years old. His mother and father are both editors. I call this the smiling Buddha in a basket, without reference to, or I hope offense to, the Buddhists among us. So I'd like to start today by surveying everybody. And I have 3 assistants. Could my 3 assistants stand up? I'd like to survey and find out how old you think children are when they begin to understand that they live on a planet and share that planet with other children. So we're only talking about beginning points. At what age is a child when they begin to understand that they live on a planet and share that planet with other children? And if you could use your fingers to determine. If you need more than 2, then you can double. So and then if we're going to see what the survey results are. Right, Mike, when you gotta come back. So there's a range of So I've been asking this question of my graduate classes for 10 years. Almost exactly the same language. And always with people who are training to be teachers who are not teachers. And 10 years ago, the average age was 11. Each year I ask the question, the average age goes down by 6 months. So the average age now is between 4 and 5. So children at the age of 4 and 5 begin, in our experience, now I'm not asking, I don't think there's a right answer. There's an answer of what you perceive. What is your perception of children? So in the last 10 years, children are potentially seeing themselves on a planet with other children earlier than they were 10 years ago. And I think that has implications for teachers. Big implications. Now, it doesn't mean they have a sophisticated understanding, but they have at the beginning of an understanding. I want to just take a minute to tell you a story, because last Wednesday, I was driving to work after a mostly sleepless night. And I was trying to think of how I was going to handle the results of the election in a nonpartisan way with my students, as many teachers probably were dealing with that day. And I decided to tell the story of the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And it took 3 years to agree in the Congress. After the Constitution was adopted, 3 years to agree on the Bill of Rights, because there were contentious issues that still today we're not quite sure what they mean. I had an opportunity when I was working in Zambia for the UN Institute for Namibia to see firsthand the development of a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. And by chance, I was working as an administrator at the end of the UN project. And the director of the institute, who was the former Minister of Justice in Tanzania, Mark Bomani, asked me to prepare this room. I had to get a room ready. I said, what are they using? Well, he said they're preparing for the negotiations for the Bill of Rights in Namibia before independence. And this was the government in exile that was preparing. And they had spent 20 years sending out their young scholars to study election systems or electoral systems around the world. And among the systems they studied were the U.S. system. And they actually published a book, Comparative Electoral Systems, Political Consequences, before independence. And I was struck by the fact that I was asked to set up effectively the Philadelphia the story really comes around when several months later, after the elections took place and after the negotiations took place with then the Democratic Turn Hall Alliance that were illegally administering Namibia and then Southwest Africa. I met with my former boss, Mose Chitendero, who served until his death as the Speaker of Parliament in Namibia. He was the one that hired me to UNESCO. And I was speaking on the rooftop of his house in Windhoek in August of 1990. And he told me about the negotiations for the Bill of Rights. Now remember, the U.S. negotiations were 3 years long, and they were contentious. He said, yeah, Dirk Mudge, who was the head of the DTA, was shocked. He said they went into the negotiations, they had spent months detailing all of their background positions, what they would give up. He said, Dirk Mudge stood up at the end of the meeting and he said, we have had a guerrilla campaign with you for 19 years. And yet we sit here around the table after 3 hours of negotiations and we have agreed on a Bill of Rights. He couldn't believe it was possible. And when I was thinking about that, driving to work the other day, I realized that no matter what we go through as a nation, our own experience in history is used by the rest of the world. It's redemptive. And sometimes you need experience like this to realize other countries have actually benefited from this. And I have no doubt other countries will benefit from our current experience. And I actually think that's how we have to explain to children sometimes when there are things we can't explain. Why is this happening? Our history will at least be useful to us, if not other people. The Convention of the Rights of the Child has been adopted by every country in the world except one. And I think all of my students now know what that country is. Somalia was the penultimate country, and they adopted it, I think, last year. This morning, and this is news for the dean, we were able to organize our field experience so that 100 students in grade 4 at Williams School had an intensive 1-hour study of the Convention of the Rights of the Child with our 57 candidates. And the report back I have from the candidates, with the accession and permission of the teachers, was that children at Williams School in Bridgewater were able to get an idea of what home life is like for many children in the world. They have an idea of what school life is like or not like for many children in the world. What forced labor is like for many children in the world. What forced work as a warrior is for many children. When children are drafted and forced to be child soldiers. And what lack of health facilities, basic health facilities, means for some children. And when we briefed this morning, it was clear to us 2 things that I was hoping we would find. One was that the kids knew more than we thought they knew. Not about the convention, that might have been new to them, but about the nature of living overseas and the nature of being empathetic to that is something that many children that you reported to me this morning were able to achieve. So this capacity for empathy may well be part of the phenomena that in the last decade, children who were 10, now at the age of 4 and a half or 5, are able to understand they live on a planet with other children. Maybe that's something that has come into their consciousness. And so for the convention itself, and this was the text we used, one written by David Smith, and there are 2 other books I can recommend by David Smith and the same illustrator. One, If the World Were a Village, and If the United States or If America Were a Village, which scales up and down the nature of America and the nature of the world as if it was a village of 100 people. And then actually using the Convention of the Rights of the Child, comments on all these aspects of life. And so, for me, today, I really think that the Convention of the Rights of the Child, if someone asked me to explain in a single sentence what it meant to children, today I would say this consciousness that they have of other children and of their place with other children lets them understand that they are no less worthy and other children are no less worthy than they are. That's what human rights is. Human rights is a matter of worth. Now, the difficulty is that we live in a materialist culture where your worth is decided by your wealth, not your character. A little bit about my family history. My ancestor Richard came in 1630, but the Pilgrims, as we all know, came 10 years earlier. And they landed in Provincetown, and they found there wasn't much place to shelter there. They landed on the 11th November, and William Bradford himself kept a diary. And I read from the diary, when they finally landed on shore, he wrote, "Being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element." Now, our understanding of the firm and stable earth today is a little bit different for children than it was in 1620 or 1630 or in 1692. Children have a fairly sophisticated understanding of the world. Recently, I had a chance this summer to read a book about the witches of Salem. I actually had a student last term whose ancestor was one of the people involved in the trial. It's interesting how we introduce. In 1692, the Mass Bay Colony executed 14 women, 5 men, and 2 dogs for witchcraft. The sorcery materialized in January. The first hanging took place in June, the last in September. So children, at that time, young children would look up in the night sky and they would see, well, they would see a witch's broom. Now, why do they call it a witch's broom? Well, I needed to really give you the impact of this, and I got this from my brother's 5 acres in Maine. This is a witch's broom. And it's a virus that runs and grows quite unexpectedly at right angles off a branch. It's really not a branch. And if you look up into the moonlit sky at night, what your parents will tell you when you say, "Mommy, what is that?" They will say, "Well, the witch landed on that tree and left her broom behind." So that's why it's a witch's broom. We have a little bit of a different picture that children have of the night sky. Now, when children look up at the night sky, they have access to other images that they will have to refer to. So when they look up at the night sky, they might see the moon. They might understand even the moon's relationship to the earth. In fact, they learn it early in elementary school. And they might have seen pictures of the moon, of the earth from the moon. And that was the kind of vision I had when I grew up, because I grew up in what I call, I grew up in a home that I like to think of as Apollo's carpenter. Because my father was a carpenter. He was a special kind of carpenter. He was a master carpenter who made models. They call it a pattern maker. And his job was to make models of the command module of the Apollo, because they actually couldn't calibrate the machinery to construct it unless they had a one-to-one model of it. And so at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the Air and Space Museum, this is Apollo 13. And you see it standing on its edge, and you see the burnt-out heat shield on the left side. It's blue and gray. And that was the shape that my father had to recreate before they could build that. They had to recreate that shape out of wood. But he was a shipwright. So that's how shipwrights build ships. They have to have the keel has to be a certain shape. And he was also a pattern maker, so he could make a one-to-one. For me, this was normal to understand that a carpenter was necessary to go to the moon. Counterintuitive. They must be rocket scientists. My father was not a rocket scientist. He was a carpenter. But what I also had as a youngster was this idea of the moon, a different vision in the sky. So when I looked up at the sky in July of 1969, and there was a human being on the moon, this is what I could imagine, what we call an earthrise. We're all used to sunrises, but now you can keep in your mind once you see it an earthrise. This is a picture, I think, from Apollo 8, one of the pictures from Apollo 8. in December of 1968 from the moon, showing the moon and the Earth in perspective. First time as a species that we saw that. Everything changed after that. Because once you have this picture, you can't forget. So this view also helps us understand one other thing. And for the past several years, I've taught a course, a storytelling course, that challenges students to compare their own lives to the human journey out of Africa. Connect your presence on the planet, your small social story, the little story, with the big story of the human journey. What has really helped us to tell this story is not just the science of paleoanthropology, or the science of linguistics, or the science of even music, but also the fact that you can view the Earth as a single sphere. Once you see a sphere, in fact, I noticed, I don't have a slide for it, but I was thinking in the last 24 hours, about 10 years ago, when you watched a weather forecast, you'd have a flat screen. There would be no image of the horizon. Now, if you watch a weather forecast, you can never see a flat screen. There's a horizon in every picture. Because that's the true Earth. If you look at the United States on relief, you're always going to see the horizon of the planet. So this idea that the planet is a single organism, 20 years ago was called Gaia, this Gaia theory. It's now a scientific fact. It's understood by weather systems, by biologic systems, that the Earth is a single organism that we are part of. The picture reinforces that. It's not magical thinking. So I want to present 3 pieces of evidence that children at the age of 4, 5, or 6 today have an opportunity to view a world that's emerging. So I'd like to share 3 pieces of evidence for this. First piece of evidence is from the Boston Globe over the past 10 years. Every June, usually it's the last day of May or the first day of June, they publish the photos of the valedictorians in Boston schools. And there are about 40 Boston schools, so you have lots to choose from. Every year, since 2005, the rate of valedictorians not being born in the United States is about 1 to 1. For every valedictorian born in the United States, there's a valedictorian born outside the United States. But it's not just the rate that's really surprising. It's the geographic spread. In the 10 years, which I've been keeping these, there are 38 countries represented, including Somalia, Jamaica, Albania, Dominican Republic, China, Nepal, Haiti, Peru, Vietnam, Guatemala, Ireland, Kenya, Nigeria, Bangladesh, El Salvador, Lebanon, Colombia, Cape Verde, Morocco, Cameroon, India, Malaysia, Senegal, Greece, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Hong Kong, Lesotho, Thailand, Peru, Uganda, Venezuela, Bangladesh, Tibet, Guinea, Liberia, and Trinidad. Now what's significant in my mind is not just the spread. It tends to validate the idea that human capacity or even human genius is found everywhere in the pool of human beings in our own genetic structure. We're going to find capacity everywhere. To me, this is a validation of that. But it's also a validation that if we just drive a few miles down the street to Boston, we find the world. The world is already here. For whatever reason, whether it be the medical industry that's here, the world is here for us. So that's the first piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence, we have another survey. If I could have my survey. My survey. Okay, so this is a question I've been asking for 10 years as well. A little bit personal, so I'll try to do it in a sensitive way. How many of us have been in an interracial relationship or know directly of an interracial relationship? So if you could just count and see what percentage of the group is. Have been in one or have directly been associated with one. Okay, did this survey, the response rate was between 10 and 20%. Now, it was the same criteria, seen or been involved. Today, it was 80, 10 years later. Now, is this a scientific poll? No. It's a poll of the people we work with. This has, I think, an impact on children when they see it, when they're friends. That has a powerful influence on how kids think about themselves and others. Third piece of evidence. That's Mayor de Blasio. That's actually evidence number 2. That's Mayor de Blasio of New York City with his wife and children. Third piece of evidence is advertising. 10 years ago, I had a $100 bill that I would bring to class, not to bribe people, but to bed people. And I had a $100 bill, and I was willing to give at the beginning of a class that $100 bill if they could find a print or media caption of an interracial couple. John remembers me doing this. And for 5 years, I kept that $100. And then one day I saw one. I never longer made that bet. And students would look, students would look. Today, we don't even have to look to find interracial couples. Now, it may simply mean that advertisers have 2 markets at once, two demographics at once. But this is pretty evocative, even for Ralph Lauren. How old are these kids? Less than 10, I think. Yeah. Wow. Now this is just evidence. And the evidence leads me to this assertion that I think was validated this morning at Williams School. That we tend to underestimate the capacity of young people to begin to gain insights about the nature of the world and their place in it. We tend to think, oh, they won't understand. Yeah, they do. And they not only understand, they probably have some insights they've gained, and they're not quite sure how to articulate those insights. And as teachers, we almost have to redraw the expectations of our curriculum frameworks accordingly. And so for children, there is this insight that's available to them if teachers allow them to go there. And that is the insight that they begin to realize that they're part of a species. Whether you look at it from a biological point of view or a social point of view, they're part of a species that recognizes one another. And so our job as a teacher, and this is something that I was only able to articulate through the help of my students in the last month or so, that we have 3 jobs. And these are the 3 worlds. We have to expand our own world, the way we think about the world. Then we can begin to understand the world of the children, as we tried to this morning and over the past several weeks at Williams School. And we then can introduce children to the world. But unless and until we expand our own world, we're then just going to introduce them to the old world, and not the world that they're sensing is already there. So I promised at the beginning that I had structured this talk based upon a poem I wrote for my grandson. And we have the privilege of having among us an award-winning poet, nationally recognized by Columbia University. And I've invited Taylor to come up and read the poem that I wrote to my grandson. And I hope you'll find that the poem wrote the speech. And you'll recognize parts of what I talked about in the poem. Taylor.
The firm and stable earth, to Finn at 19 months. 11 November 2014, read today's calendar. 6 years short of 400, at least by one reckoning. On that day in 1620, a small band on the religious margins, anchored offshore a wide bay and stepped onto strange and desperate sands, of which Providence and a cape be now named. It is recorded that their first impulse was to pray. They fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. There they found dear comfort in holly, birch, walnut, and ash trees lining the shores, and also human comfort from souls whose aboriginal blood coursed on the continent for 10,000 years. Your ancestor, Richard Sylvester, followed on a decade later on the Mary and John from Somerset in England. His hope lay in some measure of religious belief from the centuries of storms of disbelief in Europe. But they bolted the door to his free spirit and thought, so he settled in Scituate, Yemen farmer, constable and surveyor who signed his will by a mark, being learned only from the schoolhouse of life's English. So our ancestors from Kensham and the Great Migration itself took this New England as their New Jerusalem and sought a new earth, a heavenly transformed, for man is the supreme talisman, a telluric amulet of bone and blood and spirit. Today, at this present juncture of your 19 months, a Messiah journeyman sought storyteller's help from your father, a fellow son of Africa, an African earth child knowing value in the firm and stable truth of one born of Africa's dust. Some years ahead, at your later age of 19 years, your parents will take you to Washington, to gaze on the burned shell of a ship, named after the Greek god Apollo, a ship your great-grandfather Ray helped to build. A ship that anchored offshore of the moon, while the whole earth gazed upon the lunar dust's first stirring under the boots of two silver-clad human pilgrims, planting their steps on behalf of the species. We all watched the shadowy steps from the ladder of that ship. What held our minds truly captive was an earlier Christmas image, that of a blue marble in space, hanging and spinning, our only home. We now know as a home we must all share. Dear Finn, whether as an epic giant or humble shipwright, or now as cosmic wayfarer, now is the time for us to all come home, to set our feet on the firm and stable earth, our truly proper element, to which each human heart and soul is bound.
Thank you very much.